Hello, my name is Jeremiah McCoy. This is Basics of the Game reviews. I am reviewing Pathfinder 2nd Edition this time around. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is interesting, and I suppose I should start with sort of the backstory on Pathfinder. Paizo was the publisher of Dragon and Dungeon magazines for Wizards of the Coast back when 3.5 was a thing. And at some point in that transition from 3.5, starting to move into 4th edition, they stopped being the in-house or the sort of licensed publisher of those magazines. Those magazines ceased to exist, but were publishing adventures, adventure paths, which are basically long strings of adventures, for 3.5. 4th edition came along, and to say that 4th edition D&D was contentious in the community would be an understatement. It was definitely a divorce from, it was not an iteration. It was a distinct change in how you present D&D. So, we had a bit of a backlash. They had, of course, some confusion about the licensing. 3.5 had a very clear sort of open license, and when 4th edition released their version of the license, it was not as open. And Paizo decided that they were going to publish a game using the open licensed 3.5 system with modification to make their own game that could continue their product line. I mean, there's more that went into that, but that's essentially how that rolled out. This led to Pathfinder. Now, I got to check out Pathfinder when it was still in sort of beta, when they released it at Gen Con. Gen Con is, of course, the big game show for a lot of people. And I was there that year, and I picked up a copy, and I thought it was pretty interesting. I liked it. I played a little bit of it early on. Most of my friends weren't playing it, so after a while, I sort of switched over to playing 4E for the most part. Not that I had any problems with 4E. It was a fun game. And not that I had any problems with Pathfinder. Let's, step forward many years. They finally got around to deciding that they needed a 2nd edition for Pathfinder. So they announced that they were working on it, released a playtest version of it, got lots of feedback, and eventually released Pathfinder 2nd edition. But it is, its bones are built in D&D. And if you are a player of D&D, you will certainly recognize a lot of the commonalities in Pathfinder. Now, for people who have only played 5th edition D&D, because there are a lot of you out there, I know that. The popularity of shows like Critical Role or Adventure Zone has created an influx of new players. So a lot of new people who the only game they played was 5th edition. And if you're, curious about Pathfinder and you come across my video, let me give you a brief sort of breakdown on the differences. A lot of the same things. The idea of levels is here. The idea of hit points, armor class. You're rolling a d20 to determine if you succeed or hit. The usual collection of elves, dwarves, and so on. are here. The usual collection of classes are here. They have different names in a couple of cases, and they handle things differently, but much of the basic structure you'll recognize. If somebody says, this is an elven fighter, you know what that is. What is different is the implementation. Pathfinder is built on a much more system crunchy level than 5e, which is to say that there was a little more complexity to it, a little more customization. Some things that were sort of vaguely hand waved in 5e. The DM's decision to I'll allow that effect or so on. It's much more described in Pathfinder. There are a lot more points of choice in Pathfinder, and I'm going to break down some of those. But essentially, Pathfinder and 5e, if you're coming from 5e into Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the biggest change you're going to notice is that there's a lot more details, fine control, little rules to give you a little more refined control. Now, I'm going to start by saying I actually liked Pathfinder originally. My biggest complaint with Pathfinder is that it got a bit bloated. Bloat is maybe not the right word, but there was a lot of books out for it. And it seemed like towards the end there, if you got a previous, if you've got a previous book and another book comes out with a new option that is like the old option but better, you were playing at a disadvantage. A lot of the times we refer to this as system mastery. Back in 3.5, system mastery was a big thing, and Pathfinder had first edition definitely had a lot of that. And you could make bad choices. You could pick the wrong feats and so on, and it would really make your character less fun to play, especially when compared to other PCs. And the fact that there were so many books it also made it just hard to keep up with. Pathfinder 2nd Edition seems to have slowed down its release cycle a little, which I am appreciative of. And it also seems to have changed some of its basic ideas enough that there's going to be less. We're going to render those previous options just not as effective for some reason. So I like the fact that they've managed to do that. So let's dig in. First off, one of the biggest and most talked about changes in Pathfinder is that they've decided to change the name of races, which is the classic D&D, one of the axes of choice, to Ancestries. It's a seemingly minor thing. Like, you're just changing the name. It functionally does the same thing. But it does sort of remove some of the elements that make the whole concept of race in D&D so problematic. The Ancestries, pretty much every ancestry has a couple of has 3 bonuses and 1 minus, and to your stats. And humans get 2 bonuses but no minus. That's it. You get special abilities for being members of those races or those ancestries, but you don't get the full spread like you do in, say, D&D when you're picking a race. Instead, you get to pick the elements of that ancestry that you attach to. So you can take the feat, a feat at first level, to allow you to have, say, proficiency in the weapons that particular ancestry is known for. So, with dwarves, it might be a particular kind of axe or a particular kind of dagger. Where elves, it might be a particular kind of bow or a sword, and so on. But those cultural elements have been sort of separated off to being an actual feat that you take, which is an interesting way to handle that. You get to choice is a big element in Pathfinder 2nd Edition character creation. So you're at when you pick your ancestry, you're going to be picking a feat that affects how that ancestry plays. Now, the thing with the ancestries is that they have human, they have dwarf, elf, gnome, halfling in the main book. And then they have the quote-unquote half races, half orc, half elf, like you find in D&D, or actually just different heritages in the human ancestry. So you can just pick that as basically in D&D you would call it a subrace. In Pathfinder you call it a heritage. You pick that as a heritage, which is also an interesting change, I think. And there are chances for you to pick feats giving you, ancestry-tied abilities every so many levels. Another aspect is they've integrated your backgrounds pretty solidly into this character creation. It actually affects your attributes and your proficiency choices. And I should sort of run back a bit. In Pathfinder, you can do classic roll for your stats. They give you that, but it's an optional roll. It is not how it's done by design. By design, you start with 10 in all your attributes, and then your different choices change your attributes. So your ancestry choice gives you, bonuses and things, and one negative depending on which one you take. Your class gives you a bonus to an attribute. Your background gives you a bonus to an attribute. And a couple of other bonuses that you can distribute normally. But you're choosing how that's played out. And it's not a point buy. It's not a standard array. The choices that you make concerning who your character is actually helps make that happen. So there is that. Now, the interesting thing with the classes, again, all of the sort of classic, you recognize these from D&D, bards, monks, fighters, and so on, are here. But again, you're picking feats that allow you to make the character the way you want to. And those feats work in much the same way a subclass works in D&D 5e in some regards. It's just you're building your speciality as you go through. So, let me see. The Pathfinder rulebook does sort of assume the Pathfinder world, but you don't have to use it. But if you do, you get some interesting ideas. The Pathfinder setting, Golarion, is very old school. Kind of feels like Greyhawk in a lot of ways, which is not surprising if you've listened to some of the people who created it. A lot of them are big fans of Golarion, or of Greyhawk, sorry. And so it probably influenced their decisions here. Now, the reason I say it makes it more interesting is, so in most D&D settings, elves, dwarves, gnomes are written as if they have a monolithic culture, a monolithic heritage. And this is not to say that there aren't subraces, but there are some base assumptions about the race. For instance, elves are all, capable of archery and using a sword and are innately magical, and they come from either the forest or ancient sort of elven cities, which are invariably interweaved with the forest. There's a lot of assumption there. Whereas the Lost Omens Guide, which is the guide to the current version of Galarian, actually puts in ethnicities for elves, dwarves, and so on. So you end up with a distinct cultural difference depending on where your elf or dwarf are from, and that's really fascinating to me. Now, the other sort of major thing that takes some getting used to, if you've only come from 5e, and I suppose I should put that as like, I'm addressing questions that I know people who have only played 5e will ask. So, those of you who already know. But the way 5e handles magic spells is different than the way D&D used to, in that in 5e, if you memorize the spells available to you, and you have a number of spell slots, and you can cast any of the spells you've memorized with any of those slots. So you could memorize 5 spells and use all 5 slots on the same spell, or spread out 5 slots across all 5, and so on. That's how 5e does it. That's not how Pathfinder does it. Pathfinder, you memorize the spell to the slot. So if you want to cast 3 magic missiles a day, you need to memorize it 3 times. And that will be a transition for people who are new. People who are familiar with playing Magic users back in the day, and wizards in later editions, this is old hat. But for those of you who have only played 5e, this will be a change for you. There's a lot of ins and outs to the magic. I'm quite pleased with most of the options. They have separated magic into a range of things. So standard D&D, you kind of go from arcane to divine. Those are the 2 sort of major axes. Either you're casting like a cleric, getting power from the gods on that side, so clerics, paladins, that kind of thing, or you're casting like a wizard, you're calling from arcane power. Pathfinder, they've actually separated it into 4. So you have arcane, which is classic wizardy, I command the forces of the universe kind of stuff. You have occult, which is more spiritual, dark magic. It's a little more nebulous. It's a little more witchy, I guess. Um, then you have divine, again, powered by the gods, channel your spell from the gods, the usual. And then you have primal, which is a little bit like the primal from fourth edition, and a little bit like fairy magic. So it's spirit in the animal spirit sense, not spirit in the ghost sense. So that's the major difference. But yeah, it's a very different feel to the overall setting uh, as far as explaining the magic. So different classes and the different sort of subclasses will pull on different types of magic there. You also have something called focus spells. Focus spells are much more limited in the number of spells, but it resets. It's a focus. You basically can refocus and allow yourself to regain your focus to cast the spell again. There are some bard spells that are focus based. Some of the monk abilities are classified as focus spells. It's interesting. It's a very different take as well on the magic. The other, classic elements that we'll recognize, every D&D player will recognize, are the schools. You'll have, necromancy, enchantment, evocation, and so on. Interesting to note that all the healing spells are more or less in the necromancy school. So it becomes a much more dichotomy style magic than it is in, say, the current version of 5e. Now, beyond that, this is if you're familiar with D&D, you'll be familiar with a lot of this game. I could easily transition people over. There are a few things that you may not recognize. I think the concept of advantage and disadvantage doesn't exist in Pathfinder. So you will see a lot more bonuses and minuses to rolls. A lot more plus ones, plus twos, and so on. The way they handle criticals is slightly different. A natural 20 is still a crit, but you can also crit by hitting your target by more than 10 more than what is required. So that is interesting. It gives you more than one way of scoring a critical. They have success stages when you're doing skill checks. So a simple success is you hit the target number. A critical success is you beat it by however much. And you get different effects on your skill check depending on what those is. And they give a lot of examples, of what that means, which is interesting. I'm saying interesting a lot. Well, I think they made some attempts to make skills more easily understood in that regard. I think that if you know from the skill description things that you can do and what happens when you actually crit trying to do those things, kind of informs a better choice of, okay, is this worth trying, or is this going to be maybe not as effective as I think it is. The monster design is again very similar to D&D. The core rulebook of Pathfinder doesn't really come with a lot of monsters in it, but the bestiary is, of course, their monster book. I think I wonder why Pathfinder Second Edition has not sort of developed the kind of following that maybe the first edition did. I think maybe because the current edition of D&D is a little less contentious than fourth edition was. I think that may be a factor. So people are happy with just playing D&D and aren't looking for necessarily an alternative. That said, I like this. My biggest complaint right now with Pathfinder Second Edition is not a whole lot of my friends play it, because I would enjoy playing this. I got to play this at Gen Con online, and it was fun. They do an interesting idea with the action economy. So action economy is a thing in any role-playing game where you've got so many actions that you can do a turn. You sort of decide what you're going to do with those actions. In 5e, it's action, bonus action, movement action. In Pathfinder Second Edition, it's just 3 actions, and you can do anything with those actions depending on the cost of actions on the different things. Some abilities, they have them listed as this takes 2 actions. Okay, so you can maybe do one of those in your turn, but not 2. They have, your standard attack does take 1 action, and you can use your other actions to make multiple attacks, but you'll take negatives on each of those subsequent rolls. So it may or may not be worth the time. But I think that the action economy built into that idea is compelling. It makes it feel like you have more choice in combat than you do in 5e. 5e sort of narrows your focus in that regard, and I think the expanding it down to just you have 3 actions, how long does your action take, helps sort of broaden the amount of time or amount of options to you, and so I've enjoyed that. Now the other things I think that are interesting is they put in a lot more sort of in the base book downtime actions and how to use them. They put in a lot of different ways to customize your character. Customization is really the selling point with Pathfinder, I think. You get to make your character however you want. It is not limited by a particular, like, how many subclasses have they published? How many races, as they would in 5e, but Ancestries have they published? What if I want to have an elf that has leaned really heavily into casting different kinds of high magic or something? Well, I can take a bunch of feats that make it like that. Or I can make a barbarian that is kind of a rage wizard and take the feat that gives me the multi-class elements of taking wizard levels. And that focus on customization can feel very daunting. There's an idea called choice paralysis. And in choice paralysis, you have so many choices that you don't know what to do. And I think that is something that you risk with a game like Pathfinder. They have done a better job in second edition than in first edition for managing that. Each level gives you a certain number of choices available to you. And so you can sort of focus in on those few different elements. Another thing that is different with Pathfinder over D&D is how they handle adventures. Most adventure paths will take you from 1 to 20. That's how they're written. That's how they're designed. And there really hasn't been a single adventure in 5e where that is actually the case. There have been a couple of adventures where your combined would take you from first level to 20th, but I don't think there's ever been a single adventure, and an adventure path will. So that's one of the things that makes them interesting. They have also moved some of their world details options into those adventure paths. So you'll have different character options attached to the release of an adventure path. You'll have more details of a particular section of the setting tied to those adventure path releases. A good example is next year they are releasing Strength of Thousands. Now, Strength of Thousands is set in the Mwange Expanse. I think that's how that's pronounced. Which is largely based off of Africa. And involves a lot of different, based across its different regions, different African cultures as models. And it is, thankfully, somewhat divorced from some of the classic fantasy world elements in that regard. The classic, sadly, D&D versions of Africa were often treated as savage. The word savage comes up, which is, based on some racist ideals. This one, it seems to be leaning much more into, this is a place with genuinely, compelling and powerful cultures of its own. And Strength of Thousands will be taking place at a school, a magical school in this place. So think Hogwarts, only not written by a TERF. And it that is an example of one of the things they do with the adventure passes. We're going to give you details about this place by attaching it to an adventure that you can play through. And that is apparently a model they're going forward with, and I'm pleased to see it, honestly. But what else can I say about Pathfinder? I think this is a game for people who really like rules. And I don't mean that in an insulting sense. Some people like learning all of the different ins and outs of rules. I enjoy that. I'm a game designer. I get that. And this is a game that rewards you for sort of learning that. But they've done a better job in second edition of not punishing you for being into that. The first Pathfinder inherited some of the problems of 3.5. And 3.5, if you were not actually paying super close attention to the best builds and such, you could, you could actually cripple your character and not have as much fun. This current iteration makes it less of a problem that you're maybe interested just for the story and not the rules, and you don't really care about whether or not you're picking the right choice or not. And that's a fine line to walk, to be able to make it interesting and rewarding for people who do like that stuff, while not making it something that you're punished for not caring about that stuff. That's a hard line to walk. I think Pathfinder 2nd Edition has done a better job of walking that line than the first edition. And I've always loved the setting. I've always loved the adventure paths. Rise of the Rune Lords, I picked that up, and I was enamored with it. I thought it was great. And the world has constantly surprised me with some of its little nooks and crannies. Another element of Pathfinder that I think is maybe a good choice. I'm surprised not more that they haven't done in D&D much, and some other games haven't done as much, which is the idea of the iconic character. So if you sign up for an existing, like a Pathfinder Society game, they're organized pay. If you don't have a character, they will just let you borrow one of the iconic characters. The iconic characters are the characters on the cover and in all the art. So, the cleric of Sarenrae, the ranger, these are going to be recurring images throughout the book, and you can play them. They have comic books about these characters. There are audio plays about these characters. These characters are the iconic examples of their classes. And I think that's interesting because it allows people to attach to that class in an easier way. There's a consistent appearance that allows them to pull on. And I think in sort of the way that Drizzt is the thing that a lot of people attach to on D&D and got into D&D, or Dragonlance novels, and they attached to that and got in. This is like that, except it's throughout the book and in every book. And that is an element that I think maybe D&D and other role-playing games could really use more often. But anyways, that's my thoughts on Pathfinder. It doesn't look like I've got a lot of viewers. I've got a couple of viewers. Has anybody got any questions? If you do. Okay. I'll give it a minute or two. I think that I think I will actually maybe do a stream at some point in the near future where I make a character for Pathfinder 2nd Edition and sort of talk my way through it and see if anybody's interested in maybe showing up and talk to me about different choices that I might make. I don't know if anybody would be interested. I'll toss that up on, I don't know, TikTok or something, and see if anybody is interested in seeing me do that. But it looks like I don't have any questions in the queue, so I'm probably going to wrap this up. I hope people who did show up and watch enjoyed it, and people who watch it later on YouTube when I post it up to there will enjoy this. And I hope that I make this a regular thing. I think next week I will probably talk about Star Trek. The Star Trek role-playing game from Modiphius. I actually have a lot of stuff in queue from Modiphius that I need to review anyway. So I will probably do a Star Trek one next. And go from there. But I plan on trying to make this a weekly thing. So next week at around 9:30 Sunday night, I will be trying to do this again. Thank you for tuning in. I hope everybody has a good evening, and stay out of trouble.